Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I wouldn't say that Rosemary's strength is her philosophical side. I think it's important to remember that she comes at questions historically.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Karen Catafias, local writer. Father Bacik and Miss Catafias will discuss Rosemary Radford Ruther, Understanding Human Nature. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Karen, I invited you to come on this program because I know that you have met one of my favorite theologians. That's Rosemary Radford Ruther, and have had a chance to interview her, in fact. And I certainly am greatly impressed with the feminist theology that she's constructed, and I want to talk a little bit about that, and perhaps especially about her understanding of human nature, how she thinks of us as males and females. First, I just wondered about some of your impressions of Rosemary Ruther. I know you did interview her, and I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about your feelings about her or her work.
Well, I've always been impressed with her writing. I see in her work a real sense of nuance and clear logic, a balance that she brings. She will treat one side of an issue, but always go to the other side and come out with a wonderful synthesis from what has gone before.
I tend to agree with that about her. Many people think of her as really a radical feminist on the far left, but I agree with your assessment that there is a certain moderation in her work. Maybe some people miss that at times, but if they would compare it with more radical feminist writings, such as Mary Daly, they probably would see that Rosemary does often really advocate rather balanced positions.
Yes, yeah, I think often my reaction is this makes utter sense after I read something of her. I think she can be very persuasive and convincing.
She certainly writes clearly.
Yes, she does.
And easily. She once told me she writes NCR articles in under an hour. So she writes 800-word article and just sit down at the typewriter, type it out, and that's it. One of her friends, Gregory Baum, another well-known theologian, once told me that Rosemary thinks in paragraphs. So it all comes out to her. It's an amazing mind that she has.
Yes. I think I can speak from personal experience because I interviewed her in a car as I was driving, and she was holding a tape recorder. And when I looked at my transcript, she did speak in paragraphs, and they were wonderfully developed.
So you can attest to that. That's
yes.
Good. I've never heard any corroborating evidence for that theory. But what is clear is she is an absolutely brilliant woman, and I think our leading feminist theologian. She's about 51 years old now, mother of 3 children. Lives around Northwestern University now and worships there and maintains an interest, as she says, a passionate interest in the Catholic Church, and was raised as a Catholic and so on. So Rosemary is really an interesting figure for sure, and I think probably the best known of our feminist theologians. I'd like to talk a little bit about her understanding of human nature. Which I think, I wouldn't say that Rosemary's strength is her philosophical side. I think it's important to remember that she comes at questions historically, and that really brings a fresh slant to it. She doesn't do theology as many of the standard ones that we know, like Karl Rahner or Hans Kung does. She's much more historical and much more relational, much more interested in how ideas have developed and what their social and cultural setting has been. So I don't look to Rosemary to find a tremendous philosophy of human nature or to have dealt with all the great traditional problems of human existence in that way. So I think we have to remember that when she comes at a question, it's with a slant. It's always a question of trying to overcome sexism in the culture and trying to deal with the patriarchal society in which we live. So maybe that's sort of a framework to begin to see the way she approaches the question of human nature. And I suppose her dominant concern is the way that sexism reigns, that where women's nature has not been appreciated, and women have often been in subjugation and oppression. And maybe we could just elaborate on that a little bit on that side of the problem. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I would like to speak just a little bit about the fact that when she defines her feminist theology, she says that what's unique about it is that it's based in women's experience. And that, I think that's a bottom line understanding of her work. If you don't get that, you don't understand what she's about. Now, some people don't realize or don't see, why is this unique? Why does women's experience have to be brought to theology? Theology has dealt with women all through the years. Why is this different? And what one has to come to an awareness to, I think, is that theology has been written from a male perspective, from the perspective of those doing theology, largely from the dominant class culture.
Yeah, that's an extremely important point, and I think we could spend a little more time on that, as a matter of fact. And I agree with you that that's her dominant perspective. She wants to raise up the experience of women, not only the current experience, but also throughout history. She has that interesting phrase where she says women's experience has been erased from history. And because the tradition has been carried on by males, and therefore the distinctive women's experience isn't there. I suppose one of the really striking examples of that comes from another feminist theologian, Elizabeth Fiorenza, and where she has written a book in memory of her. And as you know, that book is in memory of the woman in the Gospels that Jesus said would never be forgotten, and yet her name has been forgotten, which is a very interesting playoff. I mean, Jesus is playing her up as her great importance and so on, and yet this woman has been forgotten. We don't know her name. So this is maybe typical of what Rosemary thinks has happened, that when we look at human nature and who we are, the women's experience has not been present and hasn't been really synthesized or reflected upon. It doesn't appear in the tradition. And thus, her point would be that we are all impoverished. That isn't bad just for women, but she thinks that's a bad situation for men as well. Yes.
What in fact has happened is that men's experience has been considered normative for the human being. And so if we talk about what is normal human experiences, we might say it's going to work, it's supporting a family, it's having a wife, whereas women's experiences are kind of a subgroup. And she's trying to say that women's experiences are as equal to a typical male experience. One way I try to sometimes to explain to people how women have been overlooked, and even outside of theology and history, is to quote a book, a line from a history book, an American history book that says, "The pioneers and their wives went west." Now that's assuming that women were not pioneers, that they had kind of a special role that was subsidiary to the pioneering men.
I mean, the implicit statement is that women were not the pioneers.
Yes.
Right. That's well put. I think of another graphic way of saying it. Someone said if you look at the story of Abraham and Sarah, where Abraham journeys and runs into the king, and the king, he palms Sarah off as his sister in order to protect himself, and Sarah's taken into the harem of the king. And it's sort of portrayed from Abraham's viewpoint as maybe a clever move on his part, protecting himself. And as someone said, well, what would the story look from the viewpoint of Sarah?
Yes.
If Sarah told a story, how would it come across? One of betrayal by her husband, of being used by a king, of being made part of a harem. I mean, how would that play? And so you could do that all the way along the line. And the point we're both making here is that the women's experience has been erased, and that we don't even think in those terms.
Yes, we're not aware of it, and it's a matter of coming to a conscious awareness.
Right, and I would say that that's one of the important things that Rosemary Ruther does for us, is raise our consciousness about these kinds of questions. So what did you say? And you used another word in there that we want to keep in mind, and that is that the male experience is normative, meaning that would be the way you would judge all other experiences. So if someone has an experience, women in this case, that's different, then it will tend to be judged as not important because it doesn't measure up to the norm.
Or defined in terms of how it compares to the so-called norm. women are less logical than men. A cliche one is heard, or women are more intuitive than men. But it's never women can be logical, can be intuitive, can integrate those two facilities. It's always in comparison to the norm of male experience and operation.
And one of Rosemary's big points is that as soon as you do that, one group will be labeled inferior or maybe even bad. And what has happened in patriarchal societies, the kind of society we know that's male-dominated, that it's the women's experience that will be termed inferior.
Yes.
And sometimes even evil. Let's look a little bit more here at this anthropology or understanding of human nature that Rosemary develops. I suppose that what she sees behind a lot of this is this dualistic thinking, that you get a number of dualisms when you start thinking about human nature. One is the body-soul distinction. We're familiar with that from the Western tradition from Plato, who thought that the soul was stuck in the body, so the soul was the good principle and the body was the evil principle. In fact, and we might just stay with that for a minute, because Rosemary thinks that's extremely important, doesn't she? Because she thinks that what happens is that males get identified with the soul, with the higher powers, especially the reasoning powers, and women are identified then with the body, and that the body is seen as carnal, as lower, and women then are seen as the temptress, the ones that will cause males to be pulled down, in a sense, because of their sort of uncontrolled emotions. So we might stick with that body-soul thing. Anything you want to, does that ring any bells with you?
Oh, it certainly does. One only has to read histories of church fathers to find that sense so clearly within their quotes like, woman is the gateway to the devil. Just are so prevalent. That sense of women being identified with the body and the body being evil is very clear. And
also, has caused so many difficulties for us. I mean, I think that's really made it almost impossible, as Rosemary says, for men and women to relate on the basis of mutuality. Because it seems like the only way to relate in this situation is in terms of domination. So that men either are dominating women or being dominated by them. And there doesn't seem to be any other way to think about it when you start out with that premise. I don't know, it's interesting to reflect on that female emotion and bodiliness in this regard. I mean, there really, I think, is a counter trend. Rosemary doesn't advert to this, but there is a way in which we often think of the male as being the aggressor sexually, men being oversexed, using women as sex objects, men simply being more into sex than women are. So, I mean, I think there's an ambivalence on this kind of question throughout history. And I don't know what to make of that. I'm just raising, I know Rosemary's emphasis is always that historically women have been identified with bodiliness, with carnality, with sensuousness, with uncontrolled passion, and that therefore that's always been dangerous to men. I don't know how this other side fits into it. In other words, I'm sure there's an ambivalence about this, because it's clear that we often think of males as more the aggressor that way.
Well, I think when we talk about women as being carnal and, that whole distorted view, what actually is being said is that women's sexuality is always in relation to men. Even in that sense, women don't own their sexuality, but it's defined in terms of how it affects men. If it becomes a source of temptation to men, so in that sense, again, the focus is off women. The sense of pride or self-assurance that a woman has in her own sexuality has not been a traditional view of women, even with all this talk of carnality and sensuousness.
Again, I don't know if I'm taking us afield or not. My job is to stay on the topic, but I'm thinking that what immediately comes to my mind is Rosemary's critique of dress, In other words, she says that males control the fashion industry, and that she has a phrase, she calls it something like a sadistic tyranny over women's body image. Now, I find that to be an interesting phrase, a sadistic tyranny over women's body image. And she says that we will have arrived in a sense when women can wear the kind of shoes they want, that are comfortable rather than that are dictated by the fashion industry. So, I mean, I think that that's maybe a way of making concrete your point, which is, again, that males define the female sexuality. They define, set the rules for what is considered to be proper or attractive feminine characteristics.
Yes, and she's certainly not the first person to talk about that. A lot of this came to the fore, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s, when women started to critique advertising directed at them, the sense of having to measure up to a certain standard of perfection that is never seen with a parallel in the case of men. That idea that men are dictating the way women should look is, a very common experience within the women's movement.
Yes, and I like the way you broadened that out to say that this is a common thing in the feminist movement, or women's movement, if that's the better phrase. But and that brings up the question about what Rosemary's sort of unique contribution is in this whole understanding of human nature, because a lot of what she says, I think, is standard. I don't know how much of it she originated and how much she didn't, but probably what becomes more unique for Rosemary is her investigation of the religious traditions, the Judeo-Christian tradition. I think a lot of that research is she has been responsible for and uncovered, and you begin to see a lot of interesting things along that line. I mean, you go back to the myth of the Adam and Eve in the garden, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden as we find it in Genesis. And again, you see what we've been talking about exemplified so clearly there. It's Eve who is tempted by the devil first, and Eve falls, and then she's the one who gets Adam to sin. She becomes the temptress and becomes the one responsible for Adam's fall. And so we see right there in the Bible this sort of sexist orientation. Immediately we get this whole idea we're talking about, women's function as pulling men down, dragging them down, is portrayed right there. And that, again, gets played out, and Rosemary's idea would be, yes, look at that. We got a sexist ideology right there in the beginning of the Bible, and you're going to then find it throughout.
Yes.
So the anthropology that's in the Bible will always represent the patriarchal structure, the outlook of the males who wrote the books in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what I've always found interesting in the Adam and Eve story is the fact that Eve's sin is not sufficient. Adam has to sin as well, again, because the male is the normative there, and even in her sin, Eve is not quite good enough, or not, maybe the term would be not quite bad enough.
Yeah, in order to cause the fall of the whole human race. She's not important enough, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Important, significant, yes.
Right. Well, once you start getting onto this line of thought, you begin to look throughout all of history, and as you suggested, the church fathers, very often with very poor ideas of women and looking down on them. We have the famous notion of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century that women are misbegotten males. That was based on the biology that he received from Aristotle. I mean, it's important for people to remember that, human race didn't understand how human conception occurred throughout history. It was always thought that it was primarily the male seed, and that the womb was simply a repository for the male seed to grow and develop, and that therefore we just weren't working with what we know today. Thus, we have a lot of these poor notions. But it was thought that the woman simply didn't measure up to the male. It was a defective human being, misbegotten male, as Aquinas says.
Yes, because the idea was that the male seed carried kind of a mini version of the future person to be born, and because the seed came from a man, then that perfect seed would be male. If a girl child was born, it was because something happened in the womb to cause a defect, and that defect had its effect all along the line, mentally, emotionally, physically. the woman was defective.
I guess, unfortunately, those attitudes have even carried on after we have a more enlightened biology these days. And we see it throughout the centuries. I think it was Luther thought of women as inferior because they were punished. He stands in the line of Augustine, the people who saw that women had sinned and caused the sin, and therefore they were sort of taken by God and placed in a lower position and were properly in that situation. So the point of this is that what Rosemary uncovers for us is elements in the Judeo-Christian tradition that feed into sexism, that is, the domination by males of females. And that therefore this creates a big problem, of course. I mean, once you start looking at it that way, then you say, well, what about the Bible? Is the Bible irretrievably sexist or not? Can it help us in any way? And I think it takes us into Rosemary's more positive side of this thing, that she does think that we don't have to just throw the Bible out as a sexist document, but that we can resurrect out of it important elements that would help us move towards greater mutuality in our society. And I think Jesus would be a really key figure for her in this. I don't want to really get into too much of the content of what he said, but Rosemary does feel that Jesus had a better understanding of human nature and treated women with respect and dignity, and therefore was able to set in motion a process that could free them up. In other words, we could still draw on that energy. I'm thinking, Karen, too, of another side of this that I think becomes a more subtle thing. That, there's a lot of people who say today, well, yeah, males and females are different, but they are complementary. You as a woman have these intuitive powers and so on, and myself as a male, I have these rational powers, but latent in me is the same sort of intuition and compassion you have. And that therefore what I've got to do is try to develop that. And that if I could develop my feminine side, the anima, as Carl Jung says, then I would become a more complete person. And if you could develop your rational side and your more aggressive side and so on, then you would be a more complete person. We often call that androgyny. It's, I think, rooted in Carl Jung's thought very much. Well, it's interesting that Rosemary saved some of her strongest salvos for that viewpoint. She calls it at one point really dangerous, a dangerous viewpoint. To think in those complementary terms. And the reason she thinks that is that she thinks it will always leave women in an inferior position. As soon as you talk about differences like that, she says there aren't any biologically based differences like that. There's no reason to say that. She does have one tiny exception to that, which we can get into if we have time. But what I want to get out is her main thrust along this line is that this androgyny, which many sort of advanced males and females hold, Rosemary thinks is messing us up. In other words, it shows the radical character of her critique. She says as soon as we think in those complementary terms, women will always lose.
Yes. Yeah, and I think you brought up the Jungian idea of the animas kind of situation, and what she would critique about that would be that you're taking qualities that are human and putting labels on them that say these are masculine qualities. The rational, logical qualities, for example, are masculine, and the intuitive, nurturing qualities are feminine. And one result is that even though we can say every person should have masculine and feminine qualities, you can put somebody on a continuum and say, well, you kind of fall more to the masculine or the feminine side. And that is not being true to the person. Like a woman who is strongly logical would be told, you think like a man. What does that say to her own sense of womanhood, her own sense of self, if being true to herself is being very logical?
Yeah, well put. As Rosemary says in one point, it perpetuates the cultural stereotypes. And then it also forces people into pigeonholes. It forces people to act in a certain way, often against what their dominant sense would be. So we got to see what Rosemary's positive sense is. So she wants us to get rid of all dualisms when we're talking about human nature. The dualism between male and female, between body and soul, between nature and grace. Get rid of all of those dualisms and think of all of us as members of the human family, as all human, and that all of us trying to feed into what humanity is all about. And I guess the word she likes is relationality. She wants a relational approach to all of this, so that we can relate on the basis of mutuality with one another, respect for one another, that everybody can develop their own gifts and talents in their own way, and we don't end up with these comparisons, like this set of characteristics is better than that one.
Yes. One thing that she does say, maybe this is getting into that one biological difference, that women have an ability, it seems, to integrate the left and right brain thinking, or the rationality and the intuitive sense. And she says that the integration is what we all should strive for. Now, maybe biologically women are kind of a step ahead because they have an ability toward that's exists a little bit more than in men. But it's within that integration that we become full people. And again, it's the end to dualism. The left-right brain kind of dualism also applies here.
Right. She wants a greater integration of the two. That is, she's basing that on recent brain research, and I don't know how much to make of all of that, but that is the one sort of dualism she admits. The only other one where she sort of opens a door is to say that there is a dualism between the exterior and the interior. So that within a human being there is this interior that we call consciousness and this exterior that we call bodiliness. And so you can talk about those two things, that as we have bodiliness and also consciousness. But we have to make sure we keep those together so we don't think of a soul stuck into a body.
Yes, and a fully healthy person would have harmony or congruence between body and consciousness.
Right. In fact, that would be one of the things she'd be looking for is integration. That would be another way maybe of saying what she is after, to pull these things together, hold them together.
Yes.
Well, Karen, we have been talking, I think, about Rosemary Ruther's notion of anthropology. I'm not sure that it was very systematically developed, but I think both of us find it provocative because as we're talking about it, it seems to trigger thoughts in our mind from other sources and so on. But I think the dominant thing that I get out of Rosemary Ruther is that she wants to help us recover women's experience so it isn't erased, get that into the mix of what it means to be fully human. She wants us to avoid dualisms between male and female because that's going to always hurt women. And positively, she wants us to live in greater mutuality and with real care for one another.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Karen Cataphias, a local writer. The topic of this week's Reflections was Rosemary Radford Ruther, Understanding Human Nature. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Minister, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.